Rene Descartes is considered to be the father of modern philosophy. So I will talk first about his life, and then the majority of the discussion or lecture will be focused on his philosophy, his different concepts, his methodic doubt, his epistemology, his metaphysics, and so on and so forth. All right. So, who is René Descartes? He was born at La Haye, France, on March 31, 1596. That's 16th century. And he died at Stockholm, Sweden, on February 11, 1650. So you can see here he was very young when he died. He was only 54 years old. Okay. He studied at the Jesuit College of La Flèche, one of the most famous schools of the time. The Jesuits, of course, are proud of him because he's one of their famous students. And Descartes is actually a devout Catholic, and he always respected the authority of the church, even when people consider him to be some kind of an independent thinker. Well, he initiated this modern thinking outside of the parameters of faith or the church, the authority of the church. Just the same, was very respectful of the authority of the church, and he does not want to offend, especially the theologians. Okay? Despite the fact that he was philosophizing, or he wanted to uh, offer, or he wanted to develop a philosophy that is independent of theology or independent of religion. In 1613, he went to Paris, where he formed a lasting friendship with a Franciscan, Father Mersenne. Father Mersenne is like a spiritual advisor to Descartes. And he also made acquaintance with the mathematician Maidorge. Uh, Although people think that he did not really have a very good health, no, I mean physically, but he enlisted in the armies of Maurice of Nassau and of the Duke of Bavaria. So he actually joined the the military. Okay. Uh, on November 10, 1619, because of the harsh winter when he was serving in the military, he spent the whole day in intense philosophical reflection. So he retired. He rested because of the winter, and he he spent his day in intense philosophical reflection, which culminated in three vivid dreams, which provided him the mission of his life. And this is the dreams that the message of the dreams, and that is to find the key to the mysteries of nature in a new philosophy based on mathematical reason. So this is the sort of a kind of mission, a kind of, what they call this. Uh, this is the inspiration that he got from these dreams. So he vowed to make a pilgrimage to Our Lady of Loreto in gratitude of his vision. By the way, Rene Descartes he had a good fortune financially, and because of this good fortune, he was able to travel around. He did not have to, like other philosophers who had to work, uh, take a work in, like for example, be a professor of philosophy, teach philosophy in the university to earn something as well. Uh, they are His family is well off. He did not marry, but he had a daughter with with their one of the, I think, with her servant. And although people consider Descartes to be not really very sociable and not very what they call this, would not show some kind of emotions, that, but when his daughter Francine, if I'm not mistaken, the name of the daughter is Francine. When Francine died, Descartes was overcome by grief and by deep sorrow. So that's just to show you some insight into his personality. Again, as I've said, he had a good fortune, and he traveled to Brittany, to Switzerland, in Italy, and then returned to Paris in 1625. He actually did not spend much of his life in France. He spent most of his life outside of France, okay? Traveling, uh, looking for some place to, to be quiet and to engage in philosophical reflection. So he stayed in Paris to work on his scientific vocation because, of course, according to, well, Father Mersenne advised him to work on this on his mission, the vocation that he got from stream. But he was unable to find peace nor independence which his work demanded in Paris. So he set out again in 1629 to go to Holland, where he enjoyed the advantage of living quietly. So, well, Holland is a more open country. But although there are, social life, commercial life is vibrant, but at least he can gain some uh, solitude or some peace of his own to do his work. So from his retreat, when he was in Holland, he produced actually his most important works. The most first of the first important work, or the first work actually, was the Discourse on Method, which he published in 1637. It was originally written in French because he wanted the French people to understand his philosophy. The usual language, the the common language used by academics in the universities, yeah, also in writing philosophy, is Latin. But he wrote this in French, and then, if I'm not mistaken, 1641, 4 years after, it was translated in Latin. Okay? But the purpose of writing this in French is be to make to make it available to the general public. And then the next 1937, the same year, he wrote the geometry, La Geometrie, which is his major work in mathematics. And by the way, Descartes is, we know him to be a philosopher, but he was actually a good mathematician. He was working with the mathematicians of his days, and this is one of his important, or his major contribution in mathematics. In the geometry, he was actually writing about some of the principles in geometry, and his works actually inspired the, you know this, the x and y, the 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 Cartesian plane. It was actually Cartesian plane because it was inspired by the works of Rene Descartes. And then one of the most important works of Descartes in philosophy is his Meditations on the First Philosophy, which he wrote in 1641. Now, this one is, the other works were already written in Latin. And then Principles of Philosophy in 1644, and then Passions of the Soul in 1649. This would be one of the, or the last work of Rene Descartes. Okay, he finished this a year before he died. And then he had another work which he the earliest, one of the earliest work, Le Monde, the earliest work of Descartes, Le Monde, or the World, which he completed in 1633. But Descartes withheld its publication because he was rather apprehensive that he might suffer the same fate as Galileo. Remember that Galileo was, because of his works, was excommunicated. So he withheld the publication of this work because this work, Le Monde, supported the Galilean hypothesis, or the Galilean perspective about. Of course, we know that the 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 idea of Galileo about the world followed from from Copernicus' notion of the heliocentric theory, right? So these are the most important works of Descartes. So Le Monde was published after he died, 16, 1664. So that's 14 years after he died. Because again, as already mentioned, because of the condemnation of Galileo, which frightened Descartes, who preferred to avoid all collision with ecclesiastical authority. I have mentioned that he does not want to offend the uh, the ecclesiastical authority, especially the theologians, especially the theologians of the Faculty of Theology of Sorbonne. In fact, those of you who have already read the the Meditations on First Philosophy, he wrote a preface dedicated to the dean of the Faculty of Theology and the theologians of the Faculty of Theology of Sorbonne, explaining the the rationale of his meditations. Okay, so he deferred the publication of this Le Monde, or the World, hoping to eventually bring it out later, but it was published 10 years, more than 10 years after he died. Now, a year before he died, in 1649, he was invited by Queen Christina, because normally uh, philosophers would write their work dedicated to, well, particular monarch. Queen Christina, he became, well, she was very interested in philosophy, and she was impressed by the works of Descartes. So he invited Descartes to be his personal tutor, and Descartes went to Sweden to, of course, he wanted to travel, and if you're invited by the queen, well, of course, who would not accept the invitation of a queen to be her personal tutor? So he went to Sweden, but the problem is that the queen, uh, the habit, or the schedule of the queen is that he would arrange 3 meetings every week with the cat early in the morning in frigid cold. So the cat would wake up 3 times a week, very early in the morning, and go to the library of the queen. And this actually affected the health of the cat. And he caught pneumonia, and then a year later he died in Stockholm. Okay, so very unfortunate that Descartes would die, very young. He was actually just 54 years old when he died. Okay. All right, so that's the life of Rene Descartes. Of course, he was, as I already mentioned, he was not just a philosopher. He was also a famous physicist, physiologist, and mathematician. The last work of Descartes, Passions of the Soul, was actually written from a physiological perspective. Okay? He was trying to mediate between ethics, or moral philosophy, and the natural science. He was trying to create a bridge between the two. Okay, we'll talk about the passions of the soul at the end of. Well, that's the last topic we are going to discuss in this lecture. So he attempted to restart philosophy in a fresh direction. That's why he's considered to be the father of modern philosophy. He refused to accept the Aristotelian scholastic traditions that had dominated philosophical thought throughout the medieval period. But his method is still influenced by scholasticism. So I wanted to do away with the ideas, with the concepts of Aristotle and classic tradition. It's not that he did not really want these concepts or these, the doctrines of Aristotle and the scholastic. It's only that he wanted to make a new start, okay, from certain foundation, okay, from certain foundation. But the method that he used is basically in philosophy is basically scholastic. He preferred the deductive method. He preferred the a priori, and so on and so forth. Although he combined that with the method of mathematics, especially of geometry, his preferred branch of mathematics. So he attempted to fully integrate philosophy with the new sciences and change the relationship between philosophy and theology. So new sciences, because as I have discussed in my introduction in modern philosophy, the Renaissance brought about new thought in philosophy of nature, new discoveries, uh, inventions, uh, scientific science thinkers like Copernicus and Galileo and Newton, advancing new knowledge in the sciences, knowledge about the cosmos, knowledge about the world. And of course, uh, there were already new ideas coming up, but how do you reconcile this? How do you establish the relationship between this new knowledge in science and the old belief, for example, about theology? Remember that although Descartes wanted to restart philosophy on a fresh direction, new ground, he still does not want to abandon theology. He still accept the theological principles. So the question now is, how do we bridge the gap? How do we reconcile the two? One example, for example, one philosophical or theological conception is uh, that God ordains everything. I mean, God is the creator. He's providence. So how do you reconcile divine providence with the new knowledge in the sciences? Okay. What about immortality of the soul? How do you reconcile immortality of the soul with the new science? How do you reconcile the existence of God with the deterministic laws that govern the physical world? So these are contrasting positions, and Descartes wanted to sort of, integrate, combine the two. Okay, so that's the intention of Descartes. So, given that, there are three objectives in Descartes' philosophy. Okay, so the first one, and we are familiar with this, is to find certainty, to find certitude in philosophy. Okay, so here, for this objective, he refused to accept the authority of previous philosophers in the data of the senses in the search for a foundation for philosophy. Okay, so he trusted only that which is clearly and distinctly seen to be beyond any doubt. Okay? To be beyond any doubt. So he tried to doubt everything. He suspended his belief about the concepts of previous philosophers, even the data of the senses. Okay? So he will only accept those things that are clear and those things that are beyond any doubt. So here, what he did was to remove the layers of beliefs and opinions that clouded his view of the truth. Only until the simple fact of doubting itself and the inescapable inference that something exists is doubting. So you know the how this how he arrived at the cogito. Okay, so started to doubt all these layers of beliefs. So he started to doubt the date of the senses and started to doubt even the teachings, the doctrines of the previous philosophers. This means doubting even the teachings of Aristotle and of the scholastics. So here, this is a quotation from the, I think this is from the, on the Discourse and Method. He said, from my childhood, I have been familiar with letters. And as I was given to believe that by their help, a clear and certain knowledge of all that is useful in life might be acquired. I was ardently desirous of instruction. But as soon as I had finished the entire course of study, at the close of which it is customary to be admitted into the order of the learned, I completely changed my opinion, for I found myself involved in so many doubts and errors that I was convinced I had advanced no farther in all my attempts at learning than the discovery at every turn of my own ignorance. So this is a reflection of Descartes that he had learned everything. He he learned everything, wanted to learn everything, completed the course, and at the end, when he was, when he finished the course, he found himself doubting what he had learned, and therefore he has to start all over again. Okay?
Yes, ma'am.
Discard the the things that he had previously learned. Now, the second objective is to fulfill the dream for a universal science, meaning it's a science that will apply both to the natural sciences, or to the physical sciences, and to theology, to religion, philosophy. That would be the universal science.
Ma'am, I put a check mark
So, of
on
course,
skill for
how
everything
will he be able
given
to
right now.
attain this dream for a universal science? This objective required him to find a unified set of principles from which he could deduce all the answers to scientific questions. So, first, there should be a method. Okay? There should be a method, principle, where he can deduce all the answers to these questions. So, his general physics is a rational justification for a universal mathematical or quantitative understanding of nature. Remember, as I told you, that Descartes is not just a philosopher; he was also uh, a mathematician and a scientist, a physicist. So his concern with skepticism in all its form was directed at religious and epistemological skepticism in general. So don't think that when Descartes he doubted everything. I mean, he cannot doubt, of course, that there is a book in front of him. Okay, but the point of Descartes is to have this general doubt about the foundation of our knowledge. And of course, the foundation of our knowledge would be our senses. So he has to, be incredulous, be skeptical about all these things, about his religious beliefs in general. Okay? So his philosophical method was also intended to be a method for science, a method for science. And in his first discussion of the scientific method, which is actually an unfinished work, Rules for the Direction of the Mind, he discussed what is this method. Now, the first 12 of the, so he actually had planned to come up with 36 rules dealing with the general aspects of his proposed methodology, but he only came up with the 12, which are considered early versions of the principles that he would later develop in his writings. Okay, so what are these? Well, we're going to discuss that later. Now, the third objective of Descartes is to reconcile the mechanistic view of the world. Remember the Deus ex machina, that the world is governed by deterministic physical laws, okay, expounded by the physical sciences, and reconcile this with human freedom and his religious perspective. So there is freedom of the will, but how do you reconcile freedom of the will, freedom, if there are deterministic rules? How can you reconcile this mechanistic view of the world with his religious perspective about the existence of God and the immortality of the soul? So these are, different, not just different, but opposing positions in philosophy and in the sciences, or in theology and the sciences. So this picture of the world as a giant deterministic physical machine threatened the uniqueness and freedom of the soul and leave little room for God. Because if everything is determined of by the physical laws, then how could God be still provident? So, of course, if those are the objectives, there must be a method in order to attain the objective. Okay? So here, the method is simply a method that will enable Descartes to find certitude. So there must be a unified set of principles for the sciences. And in order to attain this, he turned to mathematics, his favorite subject, outside, of course, of philosophy. Because mathematics provides certainty and the self-evidence of its reasoning. So these are two qualities of mathematics: certitude and self-evidence of its reasoning. The method of mathematics consists of two mental operations: intuition and deduction. Okay, so this deduction part is actually taken from the deduction of, starting with Aristotle down to the scholastic philosophers like Aquinas. Intuition is the recognition of self-evident truth. Self-evident truth. And this will figure very prominently in its concept of innate ideas. Innate ideas are self-evident truth. They're intuited, meaning they are already there in our mind. We immediately recognize this self-evident truth. Like, for example, the principle of contradiction, okay? To be or not to be. Okay? P is P, right? Principle of identity. So that's the first mental operation, intuition. The second operation is, of course, deduction, which is the necessary inference from other propositions that are known with certainty. So from our intuition, we know with certainty self-evident truth. Then, by way of deduction, by way of inference from the certainty of this self-evident truth, then we can proceed to discover new knowledge. That's why it's very important for Descartes. This method of mathematics is very important for Descartes, because this is the method that will allow him, to find certitude and accomplish, of course, the three objectives that he set. So here is a very long quotation from the method. He said, "The long chain of simple and easy reasonings, by means of which geometers are accustomed to reach the conclusion of their most difficult demonstrations, had led me to imagine that all things are mutually connected in the same way. and that there is nothing so far removed from us as to be beyond our reach, or so hidden that we cannot discover it, provided only we abstain from accepting the false for the true, and always preserve in our thoughts the order necessary for the deduction of one truth from another. So we can always discover we can always recognize self-evident truth, and if we follow the method of deduction, then we can deduce one truth from other truth. Okay, so to continue, and I had little difficulty determining the objects with which it was necessary to commence, for I was already persuaded that it must be with the simplest and easiest to know, and the mathematicians alone have been able to find any demonstrations that is any certain and evident reasons. I resolved to commence, therefore, with examination of the simplest objects, not anticipating, however, from this any other advantage than that to be found in accustoming my mind to the love and nourishment of truth, and to a distaste of all reasonings as were unsound. That's the end of the long quotation. So that's Descartes talking about the method that he will employ in order to attain the the objectives that he had set for himself. So there's the method, and Descartes came up with certain rules on methods. So Descartes learned a variety of methodological approaches in a variety of disciplines, but for him, they had all limits. They're very limited. They have their own, limitations. Okay. Syllogistic logic only communicates what we already know. So this is his critique on the syllogism of Aristotle. Okay. Of course, as a segue, it was not only Descartes who was critical of syllogism, because Francis Bacon was also very critical of the syllogism of Aristotle. But and Francis Bacon offered a new kind, not necessarily a new kind, but a different kind of method, which is the inductive method. Okay? Uh, the rules of induction. Okay? But Descartes is different from uh, Francis Bacon in that although they are critical of syllogism, Descartes followed the deductive method of geometry, while Francis Bacon followed the inductive method of the sciences. So geometry and algebra are either too abstract in nature for practical application or too restricted to the shapes of bodies. So a more condensed universal list of methodological rules was better than a lengthy and varied list. Although he was influenced by mathematics, he developed his own method, based, of course, on mathematics. Okay, right. So here is the methods, the rules of the methods. Number one, first was never to accept anything as true if I did not have evident knowledge of its truth. Okay, so that is to carefully, excuse me, that is to carefully avoid precipitate conclusions and preconceptions, and to include nothing more in my judgment than what presented itself to my mind so clearly and distinctly that I have no occasion to doubt it. So that's the first rule on the method. Don't accept anything as true if you don't have evident knowledge that it is indeed true. Avoid concluding, avoid preconceptions. Okay? So do not prejudge. That's the first rule. Now, this rule of Descartes, of course, would influence other philosophers, later philosophers. about preconceptions, about prejudgments, etc. Especially the phenomenologist uh, Edmund Husserl. Edmund Husserl, in fact, wrote a book entitled Cartesian Meditations because he was doing a meditations a la Descartes. Okay. All right. So here is the second. The second is to divide each of the difficulties I examine into as many parts as possible and as may be required in order to resolve them better. So to divide the parts. Because if you're going to look closer at this rule on the method, it's not something that is unique to Descartes. He did not invent this rule. Because, well, if you go back to the medieval times, especially the scholastics, they were already doing this. They were already dividing. One perfect example is Saint Thomas Aquinas, who defined and divided the topics into sections, into questions. Right? So, just the same, that's part of the rules on the method of Descartes. The third is to direct my thoughts in an orderly manner by beginning with the simplest and most easily known objects in order to ascend little by little, step by step, to knowledge of the most complex. And by supposing some order even among objects that have no natural order of precedence. So when you have finished the second, when you have reduced, divide and categorize them, then you have to start from the simplest, proceed step by step, little by little, to the knowledge of the most complex. And number four, okay, sorry, to make a enumeration so complete and review so comprehensive that it could be sure of leaving nothing out. Meaning you have to review, you enumerate, and then review. Go over again the whole thing, making sure that you don't miss anything. So that's the four rules on the method. Now, the moral codes. Descartes realized that he needed a provisional set of moral guidelines to carry him through the transition from abandoning his prejudices to establishing the truth of his things. So Descartes is imagining, if I'm going to build something, okay, he will have to tear down everything. He would be starting from scratch. It's like if you're going to build a new house, you have your old house, the old house will be your old belief. And you become skeptical of those old beliefs. So you discard them because you wanted to build a new house and build your house on a solid foundation. So that means you will be left with no house, with no home at all. Okay? Because you are transitioning from the old to the new. Okay? So that's how Descartes puts it. You're going to build a new house, establish this new house on solid foundation. So you're going to discard of the old house. But meanwhile, that you are constructing a new house, what would you do? So these are the moral codes, the provisional set of moral guidelines that would help him through the transition from the old house of his prejudices and biases to the new house established on solid foundation, on certitude. And this is again a quotation from Borg. Before commencing to rebuild the house in which we live, that it be pulled down and materials and builders provided, or that we engage in the work ourselves, according to a plan which we have beforehand carefully drawn out, but as it is likewise necessary that we furnish with some other house, it's like a temporary shelter, in which we may live commodiously during the operations, so that I might not remain irresolute in my actions, while my reason compelled me to suspend my judgment, and that I might not be prevented from living henceforward in the greatest possible felicity, I formed a provisionary code of morals. So, what are these? First,
mm,
obey the laws of his country and adhere to the faith in God. So, imagine you have to, you discard your old belief. So, what would you, what are the things that you can hold on to? You can hold on to the laws of your country and adhere to your belief or faith in God. Second, so here, I'm reading again from the rules. The first was to obey the laws and customs of my country, adhering firmly to the faith in which, by the grace of God, I had been educated from my childhood,
mm,
and regulating my conduct in every other matter according to the most moderate opinions. And the farthest removed from extremes, which should happen, to be adopted in practice with general consent of the most judicious of those among whom I might be living. That's the first provisional moral code. Second is to be consistent in following positions, even if they seem doubtful. Okay? Even if they seem doubtful. So here, I will quote him. To be as firm and resolute in my actions as I was able, and not adhere less steadfastly to the most doubtful opinions when once adopted than if they had been highly asserted. Imitating in this example the travelers who, when they have lost their way in the forest, ought not to wander from side to side, far less remain in one place, but proceed constantly towards the same side in as straight a line as possible, without changing their direction for slight reasons, although perhaps it might be chance alone which at first determined the selection. So imagine if you are traveling, or if you are, uh,
mm, mm,
on a boat, dark in a during a very dark night, okay, and it's very dark. You cannot see really what is in front of you. So you may have some doubts. You can go this direction, and then just go straight. Okay, just go straight. Be resolute in that sense. Go steadfast in the direction that you have set. The third is change his desires rather than the order of the world. Again, I quote him here: to endeavor always to conquer myself rather than fortune, and change my desires rather than the order of the world, and in general accustom myself to the persuasion that, except our own thoughts, there is nothing absolutely in our power. Now, these writings, this thinking of Descartes reminds us of the Stoics. The Stoics will always believe that do not be too concerned about the things outside the world, because we don't have power over them. We cannot control them, but we can control our thoughts. So we need to change our thoughts. Okay? We need to change our desires rather than changing the world, because the world is something that we cannot always control. What we can always control is our thought, our desire, our feelings. So I continue. So that when we have done our best in things external to us, all wherein we fail of success is to be held, as regards us, absolutely impossible. And this simple principle seemed to me sufficient to prevent me from desiring for the future anything which I could not obtain, and therefore render me contented. And then, this is rather self-serving for the philosopher, to choose the best occupation he could, that is, that of a philosopher. So, again, I quote Descartes here: there is a need of prolonged discipline and frequently repeated meditation to accustom the mind to view all objects in this light. And I believe that in this chiefly consisted the secret of the power of such philosophers, as in former times were enabled to rise superior to the influence of fortune, and amid suffering and poverty enjoy a happiness which their gods might have envied. For occupied incessantly with the consideration of the limits prescribed to their power by nature, they became so entirely convinced that nothing was at their disposal except their own thoughts. So the preference the for the occupation that he mentioned about the best occupation, and that is the occupation of the philosopher, is not without reason. Okay, so it's not really just a self-serving, rule, but it is founded on the belief that philosophers are accustomed to meditation. They're accustomed to, you know, long hours, incessant consideration of things. Okay, profound philosophical reflection until he is able to understand certain matters or certain things. So for Descartes, that there lies the secret of philosophers, because they have the power, they have discipline, they have the capacity to to reflect, to meditate, for a long period of time. So, and then about the language that he preferred in the discourse, he said, "And if I write in French, which is the language of my country, in preference to Latin, which is that of my preceptors, it is because I expect that those who make use of their unprejudiced natural reason will be better judges of my opinions than those who give heed to the writings of ancients only." He was referring here to the common people, the people, not the philosophers or the scientists, but the ordinary people who can understand. Okay, which for him is the better judge of his opinion. So I continue the quotation. "And as far as those who unite good sense with habits of study, whom alone I desire for judges, they will not, I feel assured, be so partial to Latin as to refuse to listen to my reasonings, merely because I expound them in the vulgar tongue." By vulgar meaning in the native, in the lingua franca of the people. So that's why he wrote the discourse in French. But as I've said, 4 years later, it will be translated to Latin. Now, here are some criticisms of the rules. A criticism of the rule, and this is a criticism by Leibniz. He said, "But Descartes' rules amount to saying, take what you need and do what you should, and you will get what you want." It's a criticism of Leibniz that, well, anybody can make that rule. It's not really a rule that is necessary, or it's not really a rule that is very crucial, because anyway, everybody does that. So you can pick out any of the rule and then apply it as you want. So the point of Leibniz is that that rule is not something very critical, because it's a rule that is common. It is a rule that you can maybe get some takeaways, but it's not really a rule that would make or break something, or make or break a particular science. And true enough, of course, as already mentioned, these rules, the rules that I mentioned, are already followed by other philosophers and by other scientists. But the beauty, in fairness to Descartes, the beauty of that is that he put these rules all together in one place, in one place. And of course, uh, it provided subsequent philosophers with some kind of a guide as to what they would do. And as already mentioned, some philosophers followed this method, this style of philosophical reflection of Descartes. So let's go now to his uh, epistemology, okay? The foundation of knowledge. How he arrived at the cogito or the indubitable truth. Descartes, so we focus on the meditations on the first philosophy. And Descartes starts his meditation with an innocent remark. And again, I will quote him here. Some years ago, I was struck by a large number of falsehoods that I have accepted as true in my childhood. So, because of these falsehoods, he proposed a radical solution to this problem of the falsehoods that he accepted when he was younger. He said, I realized that it was necessary once in the course of my life to demolish everything completely and start again from the foundation. So this is the certitude. He wanted to remember, he discarded the old belief, the old house, wanted to establish the new house, establish philosophy on solid foundation. So this is what he wanted to do. Right? So demolish everything completely and start again from the foundations. Okay? Removing the dirt, digging the ground to reach a very solid foundation. Uh, Again, just a comment to compare Descartes with other philosophers. It was not only Descartes who did this, because even John Locke alluded to this idea of starting from, from the foundation to establish knowledge on solid foundation. But of course, the difference between Locke and Descartes is that the foundation of knowledge for Descartes is the cogito, meaning reason, while the foundation of knowledge for Locke is sense experience. But both wanted to establish philosophy on solid ground, to establish philosophy and knowledge on solid foundation. So, consequently, his search for the foundation of knowledge begins with a methodic doubt, and he submits his entire belief system into a test of doubt, methodic doubt. The purpose is to rid his belief system of all false beliefs and to arrive at the true belief. Now, remember the first rule, never to accept anything unless it is self-evident. So this search should arrive at the truth so certain and indubitable that the entire structure of knowledge may be supported on its base. So we started this methodic doubt. Now, the doubt of Descartes is not a real doubt, a genuine doubt. And this is one of the critique or criticism of the pragmatic philosophers. Pragmatic philosophers, James, Dewey, no, who else? Charles Sanders Peirce. The criticism of the, especially Charles Sanders Peirce, against Descartes is that this is not a real doubt. Indeed, this is not really a genuine doubt. It's a methodic doubt. It's a kind of, it's a mental process. It's a doubt that happens only in the mind. Okay? It happens only in the mind. So it's not like, am I in my right? I mean, when you enter a room, then you start doubting, am I in the right place? Am I in the right room? Okay? Or you brothers, you start doubting your vocation. Is this the real vocation for me? It's not a methodic doubt about your vocation. It's a real doubt. So that doubt is different from the methodic doubt of Descartes. When he wrote the meditation, it's as if every day he's trying to meditate. But that meditation could have been, it's already staged. I mean, it's scripted. It's a way, it's a style of writing that I may be doing this, maybe doing that. I may be looking at this wax. Is this wax real, etc. So it's That's the nature of the doubt of Descartes. Okay, so it's a methodic. It's a methodic doubt. It's not a genuine, real doubt, as in you doubt particular experiences and so on and so forth. Right? So it's what they call this. It's an artificial doubt, not a genuine doubt. Okay. So what did he doubt? The first group of beliefs are those based on sense perception. Okay? Because this sense perception could be just a matter of illusion, sensory illusions, or some forms of dreaming. Now, those that's why you have to read the meditations, right, in order for you to understand these dreaming things. So sensory illusion. So here he's doubting the the data coming from the senses. So if you put, for example, say a stick or a pencil in a glass half full of water, and when you look at the pencil, it appears to be broken, but it's not really broken. It's just an illusion. Okay? So here he undermines the data coming from sense experience. When you look at the star, is the star still there? During the night, you look at the star, or is it just an image of a long gone star? Because the star is so far, it would take 100 light years for its light to reach Earth. And by the time the light of the star reaches us, the star may no longer be there. So what we are seeing is just the light emitted by the star. But we assume that the star is still there. But it may just be an illusion, meaning it just the light emitted by a star, which could have been, gone many, you know, many years ago. Okay, so he dismissed the data from the senses, and then the next group of belief to go are those of arithmetic and geometry. Like for example, 2 plus 3 is 5. Of course, so again, the, this that's the doubt is methodic, because how can you doubt 2 plus 3 is 5? But so these are thought experiments of Descartes, and he said, well, that's how geometry goes, but it's possible that this could be undermined by a powerful spirit, evil spirit, that may give us physical and mathematical illusions about this. The allusion to this, to the demons, to the evil spirit who may just be, uh, you know, uh, putting some illusions, some ideas in my mind, which are not real, which are not true. Okay? So Descartes, because of these doubts, he's left with his tragic conviction that none of his former beliefs is free from doubt. He said, there is not one of the former beliefs about which doubts could not be raised. Now, remember, class, that to doubt is not to say those are false. No. What Descartes is telling us is he's not denying all of them, but there are doubts that could be raised against them. So he's not saying that the data of the senses is totally wrong, or that mathematical truths are totally wrong. He's just putting them, I mean, what says they are not beyond reasonable doubt. Some doubts can be cast against them. We can cast some doubts on our perceptions. We can cast some doubts on on the mathematical truths that we hold on. So it's not to say that they are totally wrong. It's just that, well, they are not beyond reasonable doubt. There are certainly our beliefs. None of our beliefs are immune from doubts. Okay? So it's not to say they're totally wrong. It's just to say, well, they are not immune from doubt. I can always raise some questions against them. Okay? So if he's sure of nothing else, however, then at least there is something certain that he cannot doubt. And that is the fact that he's doubting. Because the more that he doubts things, the more that he affirms the doubt. Okay? The more that he tries to doubt the senses, the mathematical truth, the more that he proves that he is doubting. And if he doubts, then he thinks. And if he thinks, then he must exist. So that's how Descartes arrived at the cogito. So, and from this certainty of existence, Descartes would go on to prove the existence of all other objects external to the self. Okay, so this is from the discourse, and this is where we find the first articulation of the cogito, and you can see this in part 4 of the discourse. I'm going to quote Descartes here. Accordingly, seeing that our senses sometimes deceive us, I was willing to suppose that there existed nothing really such as they presented to us. And because some men err in reasoning and fall into paralogisms, even on the simplest matters of geometry, I convinced that I was as open to error as any other, rejected as false all the reasonings I had hitherto taken for demonstrations. And finally, when I considered that the very same thoughts, presentations, which we experience when awake, may also be experienced when we are asleep, while there is at that time not one of them true. I suppose that all the objects that had ever entered into my mind when awake had in them no more truth than the illusions of my dreams. But immediately upon this, I observed that while I thus wished to think that all was false, it was absolutely necessary that I, who thus thought, should be somewhat. And as I observed that this truth, I think, therefore I am, was so certain and of such evidence that no ground of doubt, however extravagant, could be alleged by the skeptics capable of shaking it. I concluded that I might, without scruple, accept it as the first principle of the philosophy of which I was in search. So, Discourse and Method, Part 4 by Descartes. So that's the first articulation of the cogito. And he will again repeat that cogito ergo sum in the meditations of first philosophy. Okay. When he wrote the meditations, he actually wrote this. When you read the preface, he was actually writing this in order to show to people that God exists and that the soul is immortal. So it's not a real doubt. So what he did in the meditation is a provisionary doubt, a methodic doubt, in order to establish what he knew all along, the certitude that he knew all along. He was certain that God exists. He was certain that the soul exists. He was certain of his own existence. But the thing is, how do I prove this? How do I prove this belief? So he he made up this, this provisionary methodic doubt in order to support that belief. So he wasn't really doubting the reality of things around him. Yes, even the existence of God. He wrote a meditation. It's just for it's just for the sake of philosophizing, just to challenge the old belief, the the belief in God, the immortality of the soul, etc., etc. So yes, he was looking for an affirmation of things he already know as true. Correct. Okay. But of course, it's like what could be what could be another example? When Saint Thomas came up with the 5 ways to prove God's existence, it's not as if he did not believe in God. He believed in God, but it's his way of showing or proving that truly my belief in God is true. He already established uh, the certitude of his existence. I think, therefore I am. So he proved the existence of the ego or of the self, and it's a thinking self. It's a cogito. But the next thing that he would prove would be God's existence. Okay, so he presented 2 arguments for God's existence. The first one is the causal argument, and the second is the ontological argument. Now, but first, before I discuss the causal argument for God's existence, the causal argument is an argument, first of all, based on the principle of causality. Okay? That if there is the effect, then it proves that there is a cause. Okay? The causal argument is part of the 5 ways of St. Thomas. Okay? Uh, the second way, which is argument from cause. Okay? So here is the argument of Descartes, and I will show you the entire. All right. So I'll discuss these parts one by one. Right. So he said, we have an idea of that which has infinite perfection. Okay. We have the idea of that which has infinite perfection. This first premise here of the idea of the infinite perfection is it's a common premise to other proofs for God's existence, like the ontological proof. Okay, the idea of infinite perfection. The ontological argument starts with the same, no, with the same premise, the idea of an infinite perfection, and of course, this kind of premise goes a long way. You can trace that as far back as the ontological argument of Saint Anselm. Okay, and then of course, by the reply of Gaunilon to the ontological argument of, of Saint Anselm. Okay, and then the idea we have of ourselves entails finitude and imperfection. So there is the infinite perfection, and there is also the idea of imperfection. Okay, and infinite perfection cannot be applied to ourselves. What we apply to us is finitude and imperfection. Okay, we don't say we are perfect beings or we have infinite perfections. Now, the second premise talks about the principle of sufficient reason, and again, this principle of sufficient reason is something that is common in traditional metaphysics. Okay? It simply states that there must be as much reality in the cause of any idea as in the idea itself. So when you think of a particular idea and when you think of particular perfection, this idea of perfection, for example, the idea is an effect. And if the idea is an effect, there must be a cause of this idea. And if you think of the perfection of this effect, then the perfection of the cause must be sufficient or higher. But the least is that it must be sufficient enough to cause this idea. Like, for example, if, for example, say, uh, you are in a balance, and then there's the fulcrum, and then you put a weight on one part, let's say 100 kilos. How many kilos you need in order to balance the whole, both both sides? It must be sufficient, and sufficient would be 100 kilos or more. Okay, so there must be a sufficient reason to cause this, right? So if the effect has this amount of perfection, then the cause must have equal or more amount of perfection. Okay, therefore, the idea we have of infinite perfection originated from a being with infinite formal perfection. So if we have this idea of infinite perfection, the cause of it must be infinite perfection also. It cannot come from a finite something, because it will not be sufficient. It will not be sufficient. Therefore, it follows that the idea could not have originated in ourselves or our ideas of ourselves. So if you think of infinite perfection, it cannot come from us, because our idea of ourselves is that we are finite and imperfect. Therefore, the origin of the idea could only be the real existence of the infinite being that we call God. Okay? Therefore, this idea of a perfect being can come from us. It must come from a real being who is infinitely perfect. And that infinitely perfect being is God. So we move to the next uh, argument for God's existence, and that is the ontological argument. Okay. So the ontological argument actually follows the same the same line of thinking, okay? The same, more or less the same premise. I have the idea of a God that possesses all perfection. So see, the same premise, the idea of perfection. But of course, in this ontological argument, he already identified this idea as God, the idea of that perfect being as God. And here lies the second, and this is now how the ontological argument differs from the causal argument. Because now we are not talking of where did you get that idea? What's the cause of that idea? The ontological argument explains what we mean by perfection. Okay? So existence is a kind of perfection. So we have the idea of a God who possesses all perfection, infinitely perfect. And one of the perfection is existence. Now, if the God I am thinking of lacked existence, then he would not be perfect. Okay? It's the same as your question, Father, about can God be a deceiver? Well, if I can think of God as a deceiver, then he will not be perfect.
Yes.
Okay? If I can think of God as not having existence, then he will not be perfect. Okay? So being truthful and existing are kinds of perfection, which we find in God. So if I can have the idea of perfect being, I must conclude that existence is one of his existential properties. Otherwise, he will not be perfect if he does not exist at all. So if existence is one of his essential properties, he must exist, and therefore God exists. So that's the ontological argument for God's existence. But again, the ontological argument is not really something that is original to Descartes, because it started long time ago. The first uh, explicit articulation of the ontological argument was presented by Saint Anselm when he said, "I have the idea of perfect being, okay, and it possesses all the perfection. Existence is a perfection, and therefore if that being is perfect, it must exist. Therefore, God exists. Of course, a certain monk, Gaunilon, answered that argument of Saint Anselm when he alluded to a perfect island that I can also think of. In fact, Gaunilon, because Saint Anselm started his ontological argument this way: the fool has said in his heart, there is no God. Okay? But even the fool has an idea of God. And what is this idea of the fool of God? That he possesses all the perfection. And then goes the argument, then, therefore, existence is a necessary attribute of God, a necessary perfection, and therefore God exists. So he, Saint Anselm used the this biblical passage about the fool saying there is no God. But even if he says there's no God, he has this idea of a God, this idea of a God possessing all the perfection. Therefore, if the fool can think of a God with all the perfection and existence is one of the perfection, then that God that the fool denies is, or the God that the fool denies exists. So, Gaunilon, in reply to Saint Anselm, said, it titled his reply "In Behalf of the Fool." Okay, and he presented a counter example. Imagine a perfect island. So you can think of a perfect island, and if that island is perfect, then it must also exist. Otherwise, it will not be perfect. Therefore, since I can think of a perfect island, then that island exists. And according to Gaunilon, it does not follow that uh, if I think of a perfect island, the perfect island exists. So the position of Gaunilon is that that argument, that ontological argument for God's existence, is not a sound argument. So Saint Anselm replied to Gaunilon that there's a difference between a perfect island and a perfect being like God. And the difference is in the very nature of their existence. A perfect island is a contingent being, meaning it can exist or not exist. But the idea or the being who is God is a necessary being, and therefore it must exist. Okay? So the distinction between uh, the necessary being and the contingent being. And Descartes follows this argument that existence is a sense of property of God because God is a necessary being. Of course, Descartes was not the last person to talk about this ontological argument, because Immanuel Kant would argue against the ontological argument. And the argument of Immanuel Kant against the ontological argument goes this way. Think of a triangle. And the triangle would have three sides and three angles as their necessary properties. So a triangle is different from a perfect island, because a perfect island, perfection to an island is not a necessary property. An island can exist even if it's not perfect. So perfection is not a necessary property. But when you think of triangle, three sides and three angles are necessary properties of a triangle. A triangle cannot exist without three sides and three angles. But it does not prove the actual existence of triangle. It only proves the definition of a triangle, the essence of a triangle, not its existence. So it does not prove the existence of a triangle. And the ontological argument only proves the definition of what God is, but it does not prove that God actually exists. Some philosophers would say that this ontological argument commits a logical leap or an ontological leap from the logical you can think of to the actual. That since you can think of this as perfect, then that perfect being exists actually. And so the ontological argument is a long, hotly debated topic in philosophy because imagine from Anselm to Immanuel Kant. Okay, so we
Yes,
continue
sir.
our discussion and we are going to talk about God and substance now. And Descartes, of course, defined God as the substance. Okay? And from his definition of God as a substance, we can see now what substance is for him, right? So God is a substance that is infinite, eternal, immutable, independent, supremely intelligent, supremely powerful, in which created both myself and everything else. So here, he, after proving that God exists, now he starts defining what God is. So he defined God as the substance with all these attributes, infinite, eternal, immutable, etc. The idea of God must have far more objective reality than he has formal reality. So what's this formal reality and objective reality? When we say formal reality, the idea, that means God as it exists in our mind. But he said the idea of God has far more objective reality, meaning he is more perfect than we can think of. Okay, that we can think of. This is somehow related to what I mentioned a while ago about the negative and positive way of knowing God. Okay? Because yes, we can know God to be this, but that knowledge of God is still limited as compared to the objective reality. Okay? So it's infinite substance, but Descartes and us, his creators or creatures, are only finite substances. So since the idea of God cannot have originated in himself or in Descartes' mind, he concludes that God must be the cause of this idea and must therefore necessarily exist. Now, after proving God's existence, so he proved, he's cogent to prove his self, then God. The next is the existence of the physical world. Again, it's not to say that for Descartes, the physical world does not exist. This is all part of his philosophical reflection of proving what he knew all along, or demonstrating what he knew all along. So starting with his own ideas, Descartes noticed his ideas of physical objects. So ideas of physical objects. The question now is, if there are external objects corresponding to these ideas, what caused these ideas? One reason could be that God caused these ideas of the physical objects and the world in me. So is it me causing these ideas or is it the world causing the ideas? But if there are no corresponding physical external objects, then God is just deceiving me. But this cannot be impossible. So God caused the ideas in me, but in order for God to be not just deceiving me, there must be a physical external object, okay, that represents these ideas. So it's God, it's the cause of the idea. Of course, uh, we have the capacity to understand those ideas, but according to Descartes, there must be a corresponding external physical objects of the ideas that are in my mind. Okay? Otherwise, if God will just be causing these ideas, but there are no objective realities, then he may just be deceiving me. And therefore, he arrived at this conclusion that there is an external physical world that more or less conforms to the way we experience it. So that's how he proves the existence of the physical world. It's not a proof for what he knew of his ideas about the physical world. It's a proof whether there is a cosmos, a physical reality. And based on this argument, there is a physical reality because there must be a physical reality that corresponds to the ideas, to my idea of these physical objects. Okay? So that's how Descartes proved the physical world. So he, of course, we can prove the physical world by way of experience because we experience it. But this is a way, again, following his how he proceeded with his meditation. This is a way of proving that there is a physical reality, and the physical world is proven as a way of making it appear, or as a way of saying that we have the idea of these things, and this idea must correspond to the physical world. Now, it's different from the conception of philosophers like Aristotle and Aquinas, because for Aristotle and Aquinas, there is the physical world, and we form an image of the physical world, meaning the ideas that corresponds to this physical world. In Descartes, it's the other way around. God is the cause of our ideas, and what we see, the physical world, corresponds to those ideas. In Aristotle and Aquinas and other philosophers, excuse me, the ideas are the ones that correspond to the physical world. Okay? Now, let's talk of substance and the mind-body relation. Descartes defined substance like this: it's the thing that exists in such a way as to depend on no other thing for its existence. So, it exists in itself, by itself, and is conceived through itself alone. And according to Descartes, only God adequately, perfectly fits this description. But of course, we also apply this to created beings, but in a limited and analogical way. Now, we know that those of us who have studied St. Thomas Aquinas, he uses the doctrine of analogy to explain the nature of substance, the created substance, physical substance like us, and the infinite substance, God, using analogy. Because Descartes did not explain fully what this, the way, in the way that Saint Thomas explained the doctrine of analogy. The Saint Thomas, in his what, commentary on the sentences, talks about three kinds of analogies. Okay? But of course, that's not the topic we are going to discuss yet. Anyway, so the main categories of substances are two: the mental substance and the physical substance. So you have the res cogitans and the res extensa. Okay? So the res cogitans are the mental substances. The res extensa are the physical substance or substances. This implies that the mind and body are two separate substances or entities. So you have the mind as a res cogitans and the body as a res extensa or a physical substance. This is what we call in psychology as a kind of exaggerated dualism. Okay? Exaggerated dualism of Descartes. The mind is a separate substance because it does not depend on the body in order to exist or to be understood. So the mind and the body are separate because they have different attributes. The body is not conscious. I'm sorry. The mind is capable of conscious acts like doubting, thinking, and willing. And the mind is not extended and does not take up space. It is not made up of parts and cannot be divided. So these qualities of being extended, taking space, made up of parts, and being divisible, these are all properties of the res extensa. On the other hand, the body is not conscious. It is moved by mechanical forces acting on it. The body is extended and occupies space and can be divided into more elementary components of part or particles. So at the beginning of this discussion, we talk about how can Descartes reconcile the mechanistic view of the world and the spirituality of the soul or the immortality of the soul. This is the answer of Descartes. There are two kinds of substances. The res cogitans is the spiritual substance. In a spiritual substance, it is not governed by the mechanical laws of physical reality because it's not a physical reality. The body, on the other hand, is governed by deterministic physical laws precisely because it is a res extensa. Okay? So that's how he reconcile these things, especially in his conception of man. So the interaction of mind and body is in the human person and describe this relation of mind and body as one of interaction. Okay, there are many ways of this. The other rationalist philosophers would interpret or would explain this because the duality of the mind and body created really a problem for the Cartesian philosophers, meaning for those who followed Descartes' philosophy. Because how can you explain the relationship between mind and body if they are two separate substances? Well, for some, it is called psychological parallelism. Others would call it there's a pre-established harmony between this and that. Uh, Malebranche would use the notion of occasionalism, meaning the body provides occasions for God, no, for God to perform his actions or animate the body. But we're going to discuss that in the when we discuss these philosophers. So it seems to influence each other, but in reality, they seem to influence each other, but in reality, they do not because they are separate entities. So this position would later on be called psychophysical dualism. Psychophysical dualism, meaning the psychical, the res cogitans, and the physical, the res cogitans, being fused into one being. So Descartes pointed to the small gland located at the base of the brain, meaning the pineal gland, as a point of interaction between the mind and the body. Because he was asked later on in his career when he, uh, how can he explain the interaction of the mind and the body if they are totally separate? Well, he points to the base of the brain, the pineal gland, as the point of interaction between uh, the body and the spirit or the mind. An answer that created more problems actually for Descartes because the pineal gland is part of the body. How can the soul, a res cogitanum spiritual, enter into the body? Now, in order to explain this, the connection between the body and the soul, and of course, explain this the pineal gland. In his last work, The Passions of the Soul, he tries to explain this interaction. And here he goes physiological, trying to explain the physiological composition of the body and how it interacts with the soul or with the mind. So this is now the last important work of Descartes, written uh, a year before he died. Now, the passions are perceptions generated and nurtured in the soul through the medium of the nerves. The medium of the nerves. So, the nerves is part of the physical of the body. And of course, the nerves are connected to the brain, and at the base of the brain is the pineal gland. In our modern understanding, the passions are the emotions. But of course, during the time of Descartes, they are called the passions. Okay? So Descartes defines passion as, and I quote, the perceptions or sensations or commotions of the soul, so which we relate particular to the soul and are caused, maintained, and strengthened by some movements of the spirits. So do not be confused because he used the word spirit here. But first, let's clarify. When he says passions, these are perceptions, sensations, commotions, or in our modern understanding, the emotions. And the emotions are properties of the soul. They are part of the soul. But they are caused and maintained and strengthened by sub-movements of the spirit. Now, what is this spirit here? The spirits or the animal spirits is a notion which is central to Descartes' physiology. The spirits function like the nervous system. Of course, during the time of Descartes, the nervous system is not, fully understood. Okay, it was they were still, trying to figure out how the nervous system worked. But the spirits is like the nervous system. So the spirits that he calls here is part of the body. Okay, it's like the nerves. Yeah, well, of course, the nerves. So the spirits are the nerves, and he explains it this way: the the animal spirits, meaning the spirits or the nerves, are produced in the blood and are responsible for the physical stimulation which causes the body to move. So don't think of the animal spirit something that is spiritual. It is physiological. It's part of the body. He said it is produced in the blood. Of course, this is 16th century. This is 16th century physiology. So don't expect the kind of understanding, complete understanding of what the body is. But see, 16th century, they are already talking about this. So in affecting the muscles, for example, the animal spirits, meaning the nerves, move the body in all the different ways it is capable of. So the body is controlled by the nerves, by these animal spirits. And it is the nerves that affect the passions. Okay? So this is how Descartes explained the relationship between the passions or the emotions, which is part of the soul, and the nerves, which is part or the animal spirit, which is part of the body. So the nerves are bundles of fine threads, and these threads contain the animal spirits, which are the subtlest parts of the blood, and they all meet at the pineal gland, which is the seat of the soul. So the pineal gland, although part of the body, is seat of the soul because that's where the passions and the the threads, the nerves meet. So the nerves and the passions meet in the pineal gland. Of course, uh, it's rather inconsistent because if the pineal gland is part of the body and it is a res extensa, how could it, you know, be the seat of the soul, which is a res cogitans? Well, it's an attempt to explain the connection between the two, but at the time it created problems for Descartes. But if you're going to study now, if you're going, we have the benefit now of modern science. We are now actually talking of the fourth industrial revolution, the 4.0, and scientists are actually already connecting our brains, which is the central part of our nervous system, our brains, to our emotions, to our functioning. In fact, 19th, 20th century uh, neurobiology can already identify which part of our brain is responsible for our operations. For example, those of you are familiar with neurobiology. Um, I think it was in 1960 when they performed an open brain surgery. It's not really a surgery. It's not really well. It's open brain surgery, but the doctor, the surgeons were able to map our brains, the brains, and which part of the nerves in our brain is responsible for, for sort of like, for example, uh, making a sound. So which part of the brain is responsible for making our sound? Which part of the brain is responsible for doing this? Uh, we know that we can say that you are left or right minded depending on the brain, because the right side of our brain controls this left functioning of the body, and the left side of the brain controls the functioning of the right body. So now people are now we cannot understand brain functions and how it affects our emotions, our behavior, etc., etc. But see, as early as this, Descartes have already, come up with some explanation about how the body and the mind connect. Okay? So, by means of this mechanism, the thinking subject receives impressions from the world, from the outside world, perceives them, and transforms them into passions. Okay? So, the nerves is a mechanism that allows us to understand how we receive impressions, and then, of course, affecting our emotions or feelings. So Descartes underlines the beneficial role of passions in its human existence. He maintains that humans should work for to better understand their functions in order to control them rather than be controlled by them. Thus, even those who have the weakest soul could acquire absolute mastery over all their passions if they work hard enough at training and guiding them. So, this is how Descartes explained the relationship between the mind and the body. Now, the last topic here is the self. The self for Descartes is a cogito, meaning it is a thinking self. Okay, it is a conscious and thinking self or thinking subject. And the first object of the mind or consciousness is itself. It's a thinking self, it's a cogito, and the first object of this cogito is itself. Okay? For Descartes, the easiest way to understand is our mind. Okay? The easiest way to understand, because that's the object that is nearest to the mind itself. And later it will understand the body. So mind understanding itself, the cogito understanding itself, and then later on understanding the body. Okay. So the first activity of the mind is thought, or the first activity of this cogito is to think, thought. Okay, thought. Of course, there are many. If you study other philosophies, then they're going to say, well, it's not really the cogito. It could be, it could be the body. It could be freedom. It could be, etc., etc. But for Descartes, it's thought, it's consciousness. In fact, it's Descartes who initiated this discussion about consciousness. Okay? Because in the meditation, he proves that the mind is conscious of itself. He demonstrated that the mind is conscious of itself. That the first, that the main activity of the mind is thought, and part of this thought is doubt. Okay, so again, you go back to the methodic doubt. Okay, and of course the cogito ergo sum of Descartes. But just a as a further extensive as clarification, it was not Descartes actually who first thought of this idea of the cogito or of doubt, no? Because Saint Augustine had the first formulation of this doubt. Okay, Saint Augustine was answering the skeptics. Okay, because the skeptics are, of course, the real skeptics, not the methodic skeptic like Descartes, but the real skeptics. And these real skeptics I'm referring to are the Neoplatonists, the Neo Academicians. So the the followers of Plato in the time of Saint Augustine patristic era. That uh, there's no such thing as knowledge. There's no such thing as intelligible ideas. Okay, so we cannot attain the truth about this. And according to Saint Augustine, well, it's impossible to think of the truth or even to think of falsehood without reference to the truth. Okay? So it's uh, doubt is impossible because the more that you doubt, the more that you prove yourself, the more that you prove your thought. Therefore, when you doubt, you actually prove that you are thinking and you are existing. So that's the first formulation of this cogito. It was first formulated by Saint Augustine. But of course, if you are not familiar with Saint Augustine, then you're going to say, well, it's Descartes who formulated the cogito. But the first articulation of that idea is not Descartes, but Saint Augustine. Okay. Anyway, so the thought is a first activity itself, and it is a unitary process and takes different forms. It begins with confused ideas. So, confused ideas or perceptions of the body, which require the cooperation of the body, the feelings of pleasure and pain, sensations, imagination, and then local memory. So all these ideas are ideas based on our perceptions. And because they are based on our perception, they can only give us confused ideas. They are not clear ideas. Okay? They are not clear ideas because they are generated through the body. Now, the soul then attains clear and distinct ideas when it starts to think about these impressions. And therefore, it begets and develops within itself as immanent activities. And the first object of thought of the soul is itself, its own ideas, like the idea of itself, the idea of God, and the idea of the physical world or physical reality. Okay. So under this head comes now the ideas of substance, the ideas of duration, the ideas of number, extension, order, figure, motion, thought, intelligence, will, etc. So our ideas of the physical world are rather confused because they are not ideas that really come from mind. But our ideas of substance, because there are duration, number, etc., are distinct ideas. And of course, Descartes talks about innate ideas. The cogito has innate ideas. Okay? So the innate ideas of numbers, the innate ideas of metaphysics, the innate ideas about metaphysics, or about ethics rather. But again, of course, the idea of innate ideas is not original to Descartes because Plato have already started the idea or the notion of innate ideas, having thought that the soul pre-existed in the world of ideas. Because Descartes does not talk of the soul as originating from the innate ideas or from the world of forms, because he's not following Plato in that regard. So I think that's the last topic, and that's the philosophy in general of Descartes. Here are some of the sources that you can probably consider: Discourse on the Method, Meditations on the First Philosophy, The Principles of Philosophy, and The Passions of the Soul.